Podcasting is on the rise in Australia. The ABC's newly released podcast research survey shows more than half of us have now tried podcasting. Not only that, but 1 in 2 podcast listeners claim to listen to more podcasts this year than they did last year. These are just some of the trends up for discussion at the ABC's podcasting conference AusPod today. One of the speakers is James Cridland, a radio futurologist, and he joins me now in this studio. Thanks very much for coming in, James. This research shows that podcast listening is up. Why?
Yeah, it's research which is not just the ABC's research, but also there's a bunch of other research showing that as well. And I think really podcasting is up because there's much more interest in it. There's much more great content out there. And the exciting thing about podcasting is that anybody can do it, not just the ABC and some of the other large broadcasters, but people in their front rooms, people in their kitchens can also make a fantastic podcast.
Are there trends within that trend? So what are the sort of demographics that listen to podcasts?
Yeah, so younger people are listening to more podcasts. Actually, 3/4 of young Australians listened to a podcast last month. So those are really nice figures as well. And also we're seeing people are listening more in cars to podcasting as well, which is very interesting for people who've been involved in radio, like me. Of course, that's where radio is very strong, and it's very interesting seeing that particular change.
What's behind this surge? Was there a particular turning point where we really saw the numbers increase?
Yeah, I mean, I think there have been a few very large, well-talked about podcasts. So Serial a couple of years ago, Trace from the ABC this year, where people all of a sudden have been talking about podcasts in a way that they probably haven't in the past. So typically podcasts have been a couple of people talking, having a bit of a laugh. Now there's lots of very well-crafted content there. And I think that's one of the things that's really capturing people's imagination.
There's such a variety of podcasts out there. Do you know whether there's a particular trend towards one type of podcast?
There seems to be there seems to be trending now in terms of much more carefully produced podcasts. So moving away from two people talking about the week's news and moving much more towards carefully produced podcasting, particularly around things like true crime and that kind of thing, which is doing really well.
Because of course people could do a podcast just with a microphone in their own home, but are people really flocking towards that podcast that requires a great production team behind it?
Yeah, I mean we're certainly seeing both of that. Yesterday, WPP, which is a big advertising agency, they invested $5 million into a podcast company in the US. Another podcast company in the US again got $15 million. Podcast companies here in Australia are also being invested in, such as Omni Studio and Whooshkaa. So it's very nice seeing a large amount of money going into this kind of thing. And also the business models there in terms of advertising are also becoming stronger as well.
On demand is so huge now. People want everything whenever they want it. Is that what is the key behind the success of podcasts?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing a lot of people who just want to click and play their favourite podcast in the same way that they would click and play their favourite show on ABC iView and other things. So, on demand is very much part of where the future's going. So
flowing on from that, what's the effect for other industries like radio and TV?
I think radio and TV coexist with podcasting, and certainly we're not seeing a drop in radio listening at all. We're seeing a nice rise in terms of the amount of podcasts that go on. But really, I think this is an ecosystem where we can all coexist, and I think that's probably a good thing.
Is this trend of podcast success sustainable?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that there's a lot of money being poured into this at the moment, and I think that's very good news. And it'll be interesting seeing how much growth continues over the next couple of years.
And what does the landscape in Australia, how does that compare to overseas?
Australians are more likely to know what a podcast is than the US, where the figure's only about 60%. So here it's 89%, which is a fantastic figure. So that's really good. And the amount of podcast listening here in Australia is much the same as in the UK or the US.
Right, James Cridland, really appreciate you coming in. Thank you.
Thank you.